Hello and welcome. In this episode, I am going to share Sasquatch encounters I found on the internet. These stories include a large silhouette watching someone in their home, calls that sounded like monkeys around a family's cabin, and a large creature wreaking havoc on a logging camp in Northern California. But first, we start with a story about a hairy creature spotted by two brothers in the woods behind their home. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode takes place back in 1993 when the original poster, or OP, who is 45 years old now, was just 15 at the time. He had just moved to an area in Florida called Wekiwa Springs to a home that was built on the edge of the Wekiwa Springs State Park. Wekiwa Springs is located in Seminole County, Florida, which has a population of 23,428 according to the 2020 census. Wekiwa Springs State Park is located 20 minutes north of Orlando and covers a total area of 7,000 acres. The OP's home was newly built and the area was just being developed, so it wasn't very populated and there was still a lot of wildlife nearby. Where their home sat was on a lake and part of a new expansion to an existing neighborhood that had been there for at least 20 years. The lot their home was built on had been woods just months prior to their home being built there. In fact, he says when they first moved in, they could only take the trash out about 30 minutes before it was collected, as black bears still roamed the area, including coming into the neighborhood. There is an abundance of deer in the area, and the OP says to this day they still have dozens wandering through the neighborhood during the day. There are also wild turkey, pigs, and bobcats in the area. He was aware of Sasquatch at the time, but it wasn't something he was interested in. When he would get home from school, he would venture into the woods behind his home and would find himself about 1,000 yards in while exploring the area. During his trips into the woods, he had the idea to try and grow his own marijuana plants, as he had gotten into smoking from time to time, so he had planted one back in the woods a ways away from his home. Over time, he became very comfortable with the area and going into the woods, sometimes not returning home until dusk. But it would be during one trip into the woods to check his failed attempt at growing his own marijuana that would change all of that. He set out one day to check on his pot plant and noticed that his younger brother had come outside just after he did. He was about 50 yards in front of his brother but played along as if he didn't see him, deciding on the fly that this would be the perfect opportunity to have a little fun with his brother and play a prank on him. So he continued into the forest pretending like he didn't know he was being followed. While walking, he would make sure his brother was still behind him and would stop suddenly on occasion just to make sure. But as he ventured deeper into the forest he knew so well, he noticed it was a lot calmer than usual. He had been traveling back to the spot 5 times a week for a few months, but on this day he saw no deer, squirrels, or any other wildlife. In fact, there was no wind or birds either. This especially stood out to him because of how well he could hear his brother behind him. At this point, he decided to hide behind a tree to wait and jump out when his brother approached. He had been walking through the forest for about 5 minutes by then, and he thought he was deep enough into the trees that he could really scare him. So he found a good tree to hide behind and waited. He didn't think it would take his brother very long to pass the tree, but as he waited, the silence of his surroundings really hit him. He says it felt like he had earplugs in. He didn't think much of it though, as he could hear his brother approaching. He was maybe 20 feet away and he expected to see him come around the bend at any second. But then his brother's footsteps suddenly stopped and he was left just sitting there behind the tree waiting. A couple of minutes passed with nothing happening and the OP started to get worried. He thought maybe his brother had figured out what was going on and was trying to scare him, so he decided to look back, but when he did, he saw nothing. He knew this was impossible because he could see a good distance behind him and his brother was nowhere to be seen. If he had run away or left the area, the OP would have heard him. It was like he had completely vanished. The woods became suddenly creepy in an instant and an anxious feeling came over the OP. His head told him to go home, but he was unable to get his bearings. All of a sudden, he was lost in the woods he frequented almost every day. He was able to calm himself and find his way back to the trail that had led him to his current spot, even though he had never left it. He felt like his equilibrium was off. He was growing more concerned about his brother as he was still nowhere to be seen. He began jogging back toward his home and calling out for his brother, who finally answered after a few minutes. He found him hiding under some palmetto leaves he had laid across his body just off the trail. He was confused by this, but just told him to get up because he still had a weird feeling. When his brother climbed out of his hiding spot, the OP asked him what happened, but his brother just asked him to please just run home with him. The OP didn't ask any more questions and the two of them ran home. Once they were safely in their backyard, he once again asked his brother what happened. His brother told him he was following him when he was hit with this horrible smell. He looked to his left and saw a big black hairy person thing standing there. The OP, a little paranoid because of what he was trying to grow out there, asked him what he meant. His brother told him it was a big person covered all over with hair. When he saw whatever it was, he was so scared he immediately fell to the ground and rolled into the palmetto bushes and lay there unmoving until the OP found him. Their attention was then drawn back to the woods as they heard 3 loud bangs followed by a strange scream. When they looked, they saw the thing his brother had described hanging from a tree branch about 50 yards away. The OP says that if he didn't know any better, he would have sworn it was a person trying to mimic a large monkey swinging from a branch. But the sight before him made absolutely no sense and looked completely out of place. They could both see this large hairy creature that looked more like a human than anything else swinging from the branch plain as day. The boys stood there frozen in place, watching as this thing swung off the branch and disappeared into the forest, yelling the entire time. They turned and ran into the house, telling their parents what they saw. Their parents were quick to dismiss what their sons had seen as just a bear, but later that night, they both eventually came to the realization that something serious had taken place that day. The next day, their father found a report of something called a skunk ape that had been spotted in Florida. Over the course of the next 5 years, the OP would see this thing from time to time, and on 2 different occasions they found a deer leg and skull in their backyard. Another time he found turkey feathers that had been left on his windowsill. At the time he didn't know what this meant, but later researched it and found out. About every 6 months the park rangers would come to the neighborhood to put out large barrels with donuts in them to catch black bears that had become too comfortable entering the neighborhood. The 3rd time the OP saw the rangers, he gathered the courage to ask one of them what they did with the bears. The ranger told them they usually take them deeper into the forest and in some rare, more extreme circumstances they relocate them. He then told the OP that the black bears aren't what he needed to worry about, and when he asked what he meant, the ranger said there were bigger, badder things than bears in those woods and that the OP should always be careful. The ranger's words have stuck with the OP to this day, and it became clear to him what he meant after his run-ins with the creature. His parents still live in that home and he visits them from time to time. His father is now retired and has become a believer over the years, as he has had his own experiences on the land, with one including orbs. The OP says his parents' home is only about 15 minutes from downtown Orlando, but the area is very much untouched by civilization, in part because it is a state park, with their home backed up to the park. The OP believes when homes were being built in the area, they disturbed this creature's habitat, and in the early years of development, it was still coming close to where the homes were built. Now he is just trying to figure out what this creature is and if a skunk ape is different than a Sasquatch. But he is researching both and says he is starting to go down the rabbit hole. I believe this is true for many of us, as it is easy to do just that. There are 2 things about this story that really stuck out to me. One is how quiet he described his surroundings becoming while in the woods, and the second is him feeling like his equilibrium was off and him getting a feeling he was lost in an area he knew very well. He even mentions having to find his way back to the trail he was already on and not knowing which way to go to get home. This reminded me of a missing 411 story because a lot of people who have had what they think is a near missing 411 experience but don't go missing, this is exactly what they describe feeling. Therefore, it is believed that people go missing because they lose their grasp on their sense like the OP did in this story. Everything becomes foggy and they are disoriented, causing them to lose their way. Another interesting twist to this is many who believe this is how missing 411 cases start also believe cryptids have something to do with many of them due to them seemingly being able to mess with our senses. Not to mention strange beings and creatures being seen in areas where people go missing, sometimes right after they do. But cryptids being able to affect our senses seems to be the case in this story. All of what the OP describes, his equilibrium being thrown off, losing a sense of where he is, feeling lost, all happened just after his brother seemingly vanished, which we now know is when he saw the creature and hid. That's when the OP began feeling all of this. As for the silence and stillness of the forest, this is something that happens a lot in these cryptid stories. This is a sign that an apex predator is nearby. I've even heard some stories, and now this one can be added to the list, where people say even the wind stopped blowing. This just makes it that much creepier, at least for me. As for what he saw, the skunk ape is a cryptid that is said to inhabit forests and swamps in the southeastern United States, which is where this story takes place. It is very similar to a Sasquatch in appearance and behavior. It could be that the creature known as the skunk ape is a variant of Sasquatches, or it could be its own thing entirely. There are species of animals that share similarities to others, and while they belong to the same overarching family, they are different. Obviously, we don't know enough about Sasquatches or skunk apes to know any of this for certain, so all we can do is speculate. But just based on the description and what the park ranger said, I don't think this was an ape or anything similar. This, especially with the weird circumstances surrounding its appearance, everything getting still and quiet, the OP feeling off and lost, the horrible smell described by the brother, I do think this is a cryptid. What do you think? Skunk ape? Sasquatch? Or something else? The next story comes from a poster who had a strange encounter in Washington State, where his family owns a cabin on the Olympic Peninsula. The closest town is 12 miles away, and to get to the cabin you have to travel 2.5 miles down a dirt road, where it is the last house. He and his family get together at the cabin every Memorial Day weekend. This includes his 2 uncles and their families, his parents, and him. This story takes place 5 or 6 years ago. The OP's aunt and uncle had flown in from the East Coast for their daughter's graduation and would be arriving late Friday night. Everyone had gone to bed by that point, with the OP and his parents sleeping on bunk beds, and his other uncle and his family sleeping on the pull-out sofa with his children on the couches. The OP laid awake on his phone and heard coyotes in the distance, approximately 400 to 500 feet to the north, beyond their neighbor's cabin. Not long after, he heard his uncle and family arrive and enter the cabin. It was around midnight, maybe a little after. He heard them come in, head for the master bedroom, and then heard them turn off the lights, as the cabin's walls were pretty thin. Not even 10 to 15 minutes later, the OP, as he is tossing and turning in his bed, unable to sleep, believes he hears something breathing at the window. But he is unsure because his father is snoring very loudly below him and he can't tell the difference between the two. Besides, the cabin's back windows near where he is sleeping are 7 feet off the ground. A few minutes later, he then hears 2 or 3 very loud calls he refers to as quintessential monkey calls. Hearing this sent a surge of fear running through him, and even typing his encounter years later still gives him goosebumps. At this point, he is laying in the top bunk, paralyzed by fear and hyperventilating. The calls sound like they were no more than 15 to 20 feet behind the cabin, right around where the dirt road ends. He doesn't remember much after hearing the calls, but believes he once again heard breathing at his window. The next morning, as soon as he wakes up, he goes straight to his mother and asks her if she heard the monkey noises from the previous night. She asked him what monkey noises, so he told her what he heard. He and his family were forced to spend the day inside due to rain in the area, sitting around catching up with one another, when his aunt and uncle, who had arrived late the night before, asked everyone if they heard the noises, describing them as sounding like a monkey. The OP and his mother just looked at each other in disbelief, and he told them what he heard. This shook the entire family and led to them looking into Sasquatch. The OP then says this isn't the only time he has heard monkey calls around the cabin, but the other times they had been farther away. He remembers asking his mother then if she heard them too. He and his family would also hear tree knocks in the area during their stays at the cabin. In fact, one occurrence stands out to the OP involving the tree knocks. He and his girlfriend had traveled to the cabin and one night had gone for a swim in the bay. The OP was still in the water with his girlfriend on shore making a fire. They heard a knock about 50 feet away from the beach where she was building the fire and about 20 feet behind the cabin. He says he loves visiting the cabin but has always felt uneasy having to go out at night to the side of the cabin to get firewood or having to go behind the cabin. I honestly don't know what I would do if I was lying awake at night and heard breathing at my window. It might be a good thing the OP's father snored so loud that he couldn't distinguish between that and what he thought might be something breathing at the window. As for the monkey calls, this sounds like a prime example of what is referred to as samurai speak. If you've ever heard the Sierra sounds, then you know this can sound like monkey calls, as the OP refers to it. Some believe it is their language, and it very well could be. They are definitely communicating though, as they seem to be with tree knocks as well. Whatever is out there near his family's cabin, which definitely seems like Sasquatch's to me, has seemingly taken an interest in him and his family. Especially being that this isn't his only encounter out there, and they seem to approach the family and cabin when they are there. This is a pattern amongst Sasquatches, as some of them seem to be very curious about us. In this case, they don't seem to be aggressive or malicious at all and genuinely seem more curious than anything else. I still wouldn't engage with them though. Usually, if you leave them be, they will leave you alone as well. This isn't always the case, however, but when they have taken an interest in and are intrigued with humans, it seems to be. What do you think about this? And what do you think is around the cabin? Also, what would you do if you heard breathing at your window in the middle of the night? The next story comes from someone who responded to a post asking for people to share their Sasquatch encounters. This story takes place in West Virginia while the original poster was on a backpacking trip. It was the first day of his trip and he had gotten back to camp early and was enjoying the evening in the forest. He didn't see another person out there the entire day. It was around 9:45 p.m. and was completely dark out when he heard a single knock come from the direction that was uphill from his camp. He turned to look in the direction from which the knock came with his flashlight and night vision, but when he did, another knock came from behind him and to his left. This second knock was much closer than the first. His immediate thought, which sent a shiver of fear through him, was that the single knock was to indicate that he was alone. Not wasting any more time, he packed up his camp and hiked out of the area. But as he was walking uphill, his light caught eyeshine above his current position and off to the right. He did his best to keep his light on the eyes as he continued to walk, but it did not flee. He indicates here that this is the exact opposite of most wildlife. The OP had been in that area before and knew the land well and was able to gauge distance with ease even in the dark. Because his night vision wasn't picking anything up, he knew that the yellowish-green eyeshine his flashlight was picking up wasn't anything native to the area, because if it was, his night vision would have been able to pick it up. He never actually saw anything that night and says that he probably would have engaged with whatever made the first knock had the second knock not sounded behind him and so close to his camp. He knew then that he was vulnerable to whatever was out there, and this scared him. He believes that more attention should be paid to the knocking that these creatures use. He thinks it could be vocal sounds more often than them knocking on trees. This is the first I've heard of the theory that the knocking sounds heard when supposed Sasquatches are nearby could actually be vocalizations instead of them banging on trees. Either way, it is one version of how they communicate with one another. One knock came from one direction and then was answered by another knock in the opposite direction. That, at least to me, is clear communication. But were they knocking on trees or using their mouths to make the noise? We as humans can make clicking sounds and other noises with our mouths, so is it really out of the realm of possibilities to think that Sasquatches could too? Just something to think about. There is also the fact that the OP felt like the knocks were to indicate that he was alone. That would be a creepy realization, especially because he was alone. In any case, it was a smart move to not wait around and find out. He, like many of us would probably do in the same situation, wasted no time in getting out of there. And to see eye shine on his way out, something was definitely out there with him. With the knocks and the eyes reflected in his light, I think we can all agree on that. What it was though, well, that's up for speculation. The knocking certainly does point to it being a Sasquatch, as this is very common behavior for them. However, we can't know for sure without a visual sighting and/or description. What do you think was out there with him that night? The next story comes to us from a poster who was 18 years old at the time of his encounter and was on a camping trip with his family near the border of Oklahoma. Now, 3 years later, he is still unsure exactly what he encountered out there. The land where he and his family were camping was very flat and in a very rural area a long way from the nearest city or town. They were staying in a cabin and it was around 2 a.m. The OP was lying awake on the couch in a room with 2 large windows facing the natural area in front of the cabin. Looking out these windows, you could see for about 2 miles easily. The OP was positioned so he could face the windows and enjoy the beautiful view. The night was darker than usual, but he could still hear the chorus of frogs outside. But then, everything went eerily quiet, and had been for a few hours as he laid there unable to sleep. During this time, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked out the window and that's when he saw a huge silhouette standing by a large tree in the distance. He estimates, based on how far the silhouette was and where it came up to on the tree, that it was anywhere from 6 to 7 feet tall. He really focused in on whatever was out there and felt like this being somehow knew that he saw it. It remained there for a few more seconds before moving away from the tree and across the field, away from the cabin. This really had the OP spooked. He ends his post by saying he isn't sure if it was a Sasquatch or not, but knows that it definitely was a possibility. The feeling of being watched would be one thing, but then to look out the window to see something standing there? I believe in that situation, spooked or even unnerved would be an understatement. Then to get the feeling that this thing, whatever it is watching you, knows that you are watching it as well. This isn't the first time I've read or heard someone describe this sensation, that the creature or being somehow knew it had been seen. I guess it's kind of similar to how we know when someone or something is watching us. As for what it was, it's anyone's guess. I included it with other Sasquatch stories because that's where the OP posted it. It very well could have been a Sasquatch, but it also could have been something else. What do you think it was? Sasquatch or something else? The final story of this episode comes from someone who shares their father's Sasquatch encounter. He was in the Navy at the time and stationed at Alameda Air Base in San Francisco, but that isn't where his story takes place. His encounter happened in Northern California when he was invited by 2 professors to accompany them to a logging camp near the Oregon border, where what was described as a large animal was destroying things at a company's logging camp. It had gotten so bad that no one could get any work done, and the company had contacted the professors to come see what the animal was. The OP's father got involved because they asked him to help them pick out some camping gear because they knew nothing about camping. While talking, the professors told the OP's father where they were going and why. And his father told them that he was an experienced hunting guide and expert tracker when he lived in Colorado. So he and his buddies were invited to come along to the logging camp in Northern California. When they arrived at the camp, they immediately found several giant footprints in the area and plaster cast them. These footprints were found around the perimeter of the camp, and the OP's father thought it looked like whoever or whatever left them was scouting the camp. The workers then took the group over to the fuel depot where they had a stock of 55-gallon drums full of diesel fuel for their equipment. Whatever had left the footprints around the camp had approached the fuel and apparently picked one of the drums up and carried it off to a nearby ravine. They found footprints leading away from the fuel that were deeper than the rest, indicating that it was carrying something heavy. The tracks led to the ravine where a 55-gallon drum of fuel and a large tractor tire had been thrown in. The footsteps then retreated into the forest. Later that night, the group sat around a fire drinking some beers and enjoying conversation when the OP's father caught sight of eyeshine just outside of the fire's light. He says the eyes appeared to be 8 to 9 feet high. Curious about what it could be, he quietly backed away from the group and the fire and tried to circle around behind whatever was watching them. But even being a professional tracker, he could not get close to the being no matter how hard he tried. He even took off his boots, but whenever he got close to where he thought it would be standing, it wasn't there. This was really frustrating for him as he couldn't get anywhere close to this being. He would return to the fire, but about 10 minutes later the eyeshine would return. Then he would try again, but to no avail. The OP would ask his father the same question over the years, if he thought what was out there was a Sasquatch, but his father would always say he couldn't say for sure because he never saw anything. He would tell his son that whatever it was had huge footprints, was really big, and was a better tracker than he was. But he really had no idea what it was because he never got a good look at it. The OP has wondered over the years if the story was true or if his dad was just having some fun with him. But he does point out that the major parts of the story never changed during his father's many times retelling it. Sometimes he would add in new minor details or he would leave out a few other minor things, but the major parts of the story never changed. He always told them the exact same way every time. He also never claimed that it was a Sasquatch because he never actually saw anything, and the OP believes that if he had, he definitely would have bragged about it. I've often said the scariest encounters, at least for me, is when people in the stories don't actually see anything. In this case, seeing eyes in the darkness just beyond the light of the campfire would have been very creepy. The OP's father was definitely brave for trying to sneak up on and get a closer look at this thing, whatever it may have been. However, it might have been better that he was unable to do so. As for why this creature was attacking the logging camp, I believe it was a territorial thing, as these situations usually seem to be. A lot of people see Sasquatch as protectors of the forest, but I'm not too sure about that. Especially after all the stories I've heard where they snap trees in half, barrel through the forest and knock down trees and tear up other plants and foliage in their way, how often they use trees and branches as things to throw at people and or their vehicles, and how they rip trees up, roots and all. I think the loggers were impeding on this creature's territory, and that's why it kept attacking the camp. Being that this took place in the Pacific Northwest, which is notorious for Sasquatch sightings, and given the massive footprints they found, I do think this was a Sasquatch. Not to mention the height of the eyeshine being 8 to 9 feet tall. However, I can't say that with 100% certainty though, because there was no visual sighting or description of the creature. But the behavior seems to point to Sasquatch. What do you think this was? And why do you think it was attacking the logging camp? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.